All right, so here we are looking at some signs and symptoms. So this is just, just an assortment of different signs and symptoms. Obviously, there's an endless potential for different signs and symptoms we could look at, but I just got out just some, different characteristic signs and symptoms from insect and disease samples we have. Also a couple of abiotic samples as well. But obviously these are preserved specimens. They're not necessarily, they're not fresh, so you'll have to just take a look and see what they look like here as they're preserved, but they will give you kind of an example of what they look like. So anyway, first we have here an example of Epicormic sprouts. This is on a birch that has been attacked by a insect known as the bronze birch borer. The bronze birch borer is actually native to North America, but it attacks stressed birch trees, and it feeds on that phloem layer under the bark. And so what's going on here is you're getting, in response to that injury, the tree has put out these, from dormant buds basically under the bark, it puts out abundant sprouts as the tree is being attacked. Now, if the tree is under enough stress and you get enough damage, it'll actually kill the tree. Now, if we were to remove the bark, we would see galleries by the insect where the larvae have been feeding. This still has the bark on it, so you can't really see it. You can kind of see some little bit swollen areas where the galleries are, but a tree that has these epicormic sprouts isn't dead yet, but it's definitely being attacked. Epicormic sprouts can be caused by a lot of different things. It's a response to injury or damage occurring on different species. But anyway, I just wanted to show you that as one type of symptom. Now, sort of related to that, in a way, is here we have the bark that's been removed from this is a hardwood species that has been attacked by bark beetles, and you can actually see galleries under the bark. Okay, actually a couple different species. So here we're seeing the insect activity, the tunnels that they've created. We don't actually see the beetle itself, but we can see, in this case, although if it had been fresh, we might have seen the larvae in here and maybe even adults. But we see both the tunnels they made and also the frass. So the excrement here from the insects themselves are still kind of packed in some of those tunnels. These actually can be kind of artistic. Some people have even done art with these. Yuri, the other instructor who helps teach his classes, he actually had an art exhibit that included some of these in it at the art museum here on campus a while back. But anyway, you get kind of a sense for what that looks like. You can see clearly that this is from, injury from bark feeding or phloem feeding insects. And some of these, like ambrosia beetles, will actually go deep into the sapwood rather than just on the surface eating on the phloem. They feed on fungi that they cultivate, which they cultivate in galleries that go deeper into the sapwood. We'll see examples of those later. So here we have a target canker caused by Nectria, a Neonectria species. And as I think I showed you in one of the videos, these are what we refer to as a perennial canker. This is actually on sassafras. These affect a wide range of host species. They usually get established on branch stubs or if sometimes on pruning cuts, but very frequently where a branch will be broken during a storm. The fungus gets established on that dead stub and then moves in that way. In fact, you can see here the original branch stub on this one. So again, as I mentioned before, the fungus will kill, a small area of the cambial layer, usually during the dormant season. And then during, the growing season, the tree tries to respond by producing a layer of callus around it. That callus tissue is, defense response, and it's trying to heal over essentially. But then during the next dormant season, that callus tissue and even more cambial tissue is killed. And then, you have another sort of year, and you have that cycle continuing. And this goes back and forth over time, and you get essentially this target-shaped canker. And sometimes you get fruiting bodies. This one doesn't have them, which would be a sign, which are these reddish brown structures called parathecia. And sometimes they also produce black structures as well, asexual structures. But anyway, that's target canker. Here we have a sycamore, kind of late in the season, but a sycamore that has leaf spots. We call this necrosis. The fungi that cause these leaf spots, there's a lot of different ones, but when the leaf spots coalesce and cross over the major veins, we refer to that as anthracnose. It's a term that refers to that. We'll go into more detail on this later, but these leaf spots, if they occur early in the season, can cause defoliation and growth loss and things like that. But that's a symptom. We're not, again, these do produce fruiting structures. They do produce signs, but they're very microscopic. You'd need a hand lens or a microscope to see them, and they're only produced during certain times of the year when the conditions are just right for it. Okay, here we're looking at a type of decay, heart rot decay, okay, on an oak. And actually, we also have probably what was some sort of frost crack or something that occurred, and the decay was associated with it. But here you can see clear decay, all right? This is a type of what's called white rot. I'll talk about those later. These are also called zone lines, which are basically barriers between different individuals of fungi causing that decay, all right? This is a symptom. Now here we have, this is called this is another, basically you're seeing the symptoms, although if we look carefully on some of these, we could actually find the culprit. But this is pine webworm, which causes these masses of basically chewed up pine needles, and also their frass or excrement. They make these essentially these clumps of this at the ends of the shoots of pine trees, and then the larvae pupate, and the pupae sort of hang out in that until the next season or through their cycle. But pine webworms are a common pest on young pine trees, and that's what you're seeing there. Okay, so here I'm going to show you examples of southern pine beetle damage. Okay, southern pine beetles, they attack pine trees through the bark. Okay, typically between the plates on the bark, like in the cracks, crevices, you'll get little clumps of resin that comes out. Okay, here you can see some of that's a little bit dried up on these, but it's not these little holes that you're seeing. Okay, it's actually the larger clumps of resin. There's one here. You can see it carefully right here. Okay, so but they go through. That's where the adults would bore in, the females initially, then the males later. They're smaller, and then they lay their eggs in these galleries, and then the larvae, the eggs hatch, and the larvae then start boring in the phloem, and they're feeding essentially on, we're called bark beetles, but essentially it's the phloem where all that nutrient is, and they, as the larvae mature and as they get bigger, they're feeding and feeding and feeding, and they're basically girdling the tree. They're cutting off the nutrients, and then they eventually come out of the bark, or as an adult. All right, so you get these undulating, like S-shaped, we call them S-shaped galleries under the bark, and also this is all packed with frass and sawdust-like material, some resin in there as well, as you can see. And again, if these were fresh, we'd see actual larvae in here, and maybe even some adults. But here right now, these are quite old and dried up, so none of that's visible. So we're just seeing symptoms at this point. All right, that is a southern pine beetle. All right, so here we have an example of an ambrosia beetle and the fungal associate. This is actual laurel wilt symptoms, or well, symptoms, and I'll show you the beetle itself. But laurel wilt, of course, it's a vascular wilt disease that affects members of the Lauraceae. And here you can see vascular streaking or discoloration of the sapwood of the xylem. You see that black discoloration. That should normally be light yellow in color when it's fresh, even after it dries. But this black discoloration is a symptom, all right? Very common symptom of other vascular wilt diseases for that matter. The ambrosia beetles, which here are some ambrosia beetles. They're very tiny. They're about the size of Lincoln's nose on a penny. All right, that's the vector of the actual disease. This is Xylebris glabratus. They're very tiny, so that's a sign. Okay, you'd see these in here and coming out and all over the place on a tree that's being attacked. They bore in directly into the wood, and they make tunnels. You can see them here in this cross section here. Okay, they go directly into the sapwood. That's because they're not actually feeding on anything. They're not feeding on the wood. They don't care about the wood at all. They just use it as a place to grow the fungus that they carry. Okay, the fungus you really don't see it much because it's very light in color, and it just grows only on for the most part, it grows just inside of the tunnel. But it also does grow a little bit in the vessels, but only microscopically. You can't see it with your eye, but it's enough to cause the tree to wilt and die because the tree responds to that fungus very early on, and it just wilts and dies very quickly. Anyway, the symptoms that you really can see, of course, are the tree wilting and dying, which I've showed you some pictures, but here's just a image, I guess. Not the best picture to see, but wilting trees is another symptom. But it's really that that vascular discoloration that you can see, when you take the bark off and look. Okay, all right. So let's look at some other things. Here we have the eastern tent caterpillar. So if you ever see black cherry trees, other members of the rose family early in the spring that have this like tent material all over them, actually it's usually in branch crotches is where you're going to find it. And if you look carefully, you can find these the little caterpillars. There's tons of these little caterpillars, and there's a whole bunch of frass material also in there. It's kind of a mess, and chewed up leaves. This is eastern tent caterpillar. Here's some, somewhat preserved specimens. They're covered in hairs, and they have these bright yellow lines down their back. Okay, as adults. So here's the symptoms are basically the leaves will be chewed off of the tree on that branch usually. You'll see a lot of leaves are missing, and then you'll see the tent itself that they make, and then it'll be sort of full of all this like frass material, and then you'll actually see the sign because you'll see the actual culprit. You'll see the caterpillars. They're usually in large numbers like that, or they'll be on the branches, and then if it's cold weather or the weather is kind of bad, they'll be inside there because that's kind of where they hang out. It's literally a tent for them to keep them warm and dry. Okay, so oftentimes we see fruiting bodies on trees, and sometimes they're kind of hard to tell what you're looking at. So here, this is a fruiting body called Econodontium. This is a decay fungus, and you can see here, it's a pore-producing fruiting body, but when it's mature, it's really hard and woody. It's kind of dark reddish brown, and you see this sometimes. People, unless you see the pores, which are actually tooth-like, some people aren't even sure that they're looking at a fungus. And I show this with an actual what's called a gall. It's a piece of wood, because sometimes trees produce these galls as well, and they can be kind of projected out on the side of a tree. And knowing whether or not you're looking at just part of the tree or whether you're looking at a fruiting body can be sometimes tricky. And you need to, one of the things you have to know is whether or not the fruiting structures produce pores or whether they produce gills. We're going to talk about that later, and you're going to learn to look for these things. but sometimes they can be tricky. And you need to know, how to sort of recognize whether you're looking at wood tissue or whether you're looking at fungal tissue or not. All right. We talked about anosum root disease or Heterobasidion, and I mentioned that it produces these fruiting bodies, but they're often sort of down in the duff layer, and they're kind of, they're a little bit inconspicuous. Here's one here. Again, it produces pores, and if you look real carefully, there's these tiny little pores, but they're not overly, conspicuous. Although the pore layer where the pores are produced is kind of a conspicuous light tan color, so you can see it when it's fresh, but it's on the bottom side. So if you just see the top, and that's kind of covered in pine needles, you may not notice that very, very well. You really have to kind of look for them. The roots in the wood tissue that's affected does get a very distinctive decay, which is this white rot decay, which is very distinctive. It's very unique, and it's kind of what we call a pocket rot because it produces these little, distinctive pockets of decay. All right. Speaking of that, I showed you pictures of this, but I wanted to show you an actual example of this, what we call laminated rot, caused by Phalanus weiryi. And early on, this is in western red cedar, Thuya plicata, out west, and also in Douglas fir. It produces laminated decay, where between the rings it actually rots. And we saw, sort of how these rings develop. I reminded you that in the other video, but you see how the decay occurs literally right between the rings. Look at that. I could literally peel those rings right apart. And here are actual annual rings that have just pulled apart. They're like pieces of paper. And it's because of fungus decays very, very specific cells in the cambial layer and causes them to just come apart. So this is from a board, essentially, that was rotted, and with this fungus, and it literally comes apart right between the rings. So you can see that, and so and I can pull those off like pieces of paper. Okay, this is caused by this. This is the actual fungus. This is the fruiting body. Okay, part of one, and then it actually produces pores as well. The pores are actually on the top here. They're very small. There are pores there, believe it or not. They're just really small, and this is a flat fruiting structure. It kind of just lays flat on the top, on whatever surface it's growing on. So this is what we call resupinate fruiting structure. So symptoms over here, sign here. All right. So let's take a look over here at some other things I have pulled out for you. A couple of abiotic things. This is a lightning strike. Just part of a stem that was struck by lightning from a tree. This is from an oak. Somebody was doing some pruning and on an oak and was able to get a piece. Lightning can do all sorts of things to trees, of course, but in this case, just one strip of the bark and cambium and everything was just ripped right off as the lightning bolt moved down the tree. And in this case, the tree very well could heal up and could survive this lightning strike. That's not always the case. A lot of trees don't survive, often because they get attacked by secondary things like bark beetles and stuff, especially pine trees. But oaks and cypress and some other species are actually quite, can survive lightning strikes reasonably well. But anyway, so you see the symptom here, right? It's just physical injury. All right, let's move on. Now this one's pretty cool. This is a really spectacular example. This is sand pine, Pinus clausa, and it has a extreme overreaction to a fungal pathogen called the disease is called pitch canker. The pathogen is Fusarium circinatum, and it's called pitch canker because as the pathogen infects the stems, usually it's the terminal shoots. It usually doesn't go into the main stem like this, but sometimes it can. But normally you get some resin reaction. Usually you get some resinosis, and so you'll see some resin coming out of the stems that are infected. But it's usually just some droplets. It's not like this. But when pitch canker attacks sand pine, and if you get it into the main stem like this, you can get these just crazy reactions. And so what's been going on here is this tree was attacked by pitch canker, and you just had multiple years of infection, and it almost created like a work of art, a forest pathology work of art, if you will. It's pretty spectacular, honestly. This was collected by my predecessor, George Blakesley, and it's been in the teaching collection here for a while, but it's pretty cool. So, there's a lot of canker diseases, and I've talked about some other types before. Another one that we'll talk about some in here is broadly referred to as Hypoxalan canker, but the fungi have been reclassified in some other genera now. But they mostly affect oaks and other hardwood species that are stressed, weakened by drought, construction damage, root damage, things like that. And the fungi attack the cambium and will attack large sections of the cambium, over huge portions of the tree even, and it'll kill that whole section at once. And what happens is then the bark will fall off, and the fruiting body will sort of replace that area that has been affected. And so what you're seeing here is all this gray stuff is the fruiting body. All right. And so it's flat, it's resupinate, there are little pores in here, it's very hard, it's a very tough, hard fruiting structure. It actually can produce both asexual and sexual spores, but we won't get into all the details of that. But I just want to show you that there's symptoms here in the sense that the bark is gone, it's dead tissue, but then the fruiting body, of course, is the sign. You see that? So sometimes a tree that's affected won't be dead completely, but you have at least that portion is dead. Sometimes this whole branch could be dead, or even just the portion that's showing the fruiting structure can be dead. But part of the other side might still be alive and supporting live growth for a while. So it depends. Anyway, we'll be seeing other examples of these later on. Okay, so here, very important disease. Which is fusiform rust. Now, these are old samples. I'll be showing you fresh samples as well, hopefully in the field, and hopefully soon, actually. We'll be seeing this out in nature together. But these are some collected samples, and here you are seeing both signs and symptoms, and on both hosts. Now, this is on the pine host, and you're seeing the galls, the fusiform-shaped galls. Fusiform means spindle-shaped. And you're seeing here the actual, what are called ischia, the fruiting structures, okay? They're dried up now, but they're yellow, and they are produced in the spring, and they're coming out of the galls. Here are some galls without ischia, okay? Or for the most part, without ischia. But these are on young loblolly pine, okay? And young loblolly pine that are affected also will tend to produce a lot of branches. It affects their growth, habit, as well as their, the stem itself. Now, here's a young seedling that was affected, and you can see, what it looks like. Now, in addition to these, I also have some oak leaves here with what are called telia on them. And if you look carefully, on the lower surface here, you have these little reddish brown, they look like little hairs. I don't know if you can see it on the camera very well. I'm going to try to, it's hard for me to focus this very well. Sorry about that. But they're very small, reddish brown structures that look like hairs. Now, before that, they sometimes will produce what are called the uridinea, and that's a repeating stage of the fungus that can reinfect more oak leaves. And then after that, it produces what I just showed you, what are the telia, the hair-like structures. Sometimes it goes right to this stage, and then it produces the spores, what are called the basidiospores, which go and infect the pines, okay? So multiple spore stages, 5 in fact, total, and 2 hosts. So we're seeing signs and symptoms. Now on the oak, there's not a whole lot of symptom development. Often, you'll get these fruiting structures, but there's not a lot of symptoms, honestly. So it doesn't have a huge impact on the oak typically, but most of the symptom development is on the pine host. All right, so what else do I have to show you? Though this is just another pitch canker example, but on a larger stem. But usually it's on smaller stems, and we're going to see lots of pitch canker in the field, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Okay, one other thing I want to show you here, some examples of, is Armillaria. Now, Armillaria is a fungal disease, a root disease that affects a wide range of hosts, extremely wide host range, in fact. This is all tangled up on me here. Now these are kind of hard to preserve, so I apologize. But the fruiting bodies are only produced at certain times of the year. Now, we just missed one of the big time periods that we get a lot of them here, which is like November. But it produces these clusters of fruiting bodies, usually, you know, dozens and dozens of mushroom-like fruiting bodies, okay, that are in clusters like this. And these are produced on the roots and stumps of affected trees. And then the fungus produces mycelial tissue on those roots and stumps and the bases of the trees. The mycelial tissue is white under the bark. You can see it here. Some of these species are actually bioluminescent. They will glow in the dark, believe it or not. And so anyway, that mycelial tissue invades the stem and root of the affected tree. It kills, you know, it can kill that tissue. And in addition, a lot of these Armillaria species also produce these things, which are called rhizomorphs. Rhizomorphs are root-like structures. Rhizomorph literally means root-like, or root-looking structure. And they move through the soil. It allows the fungus to actually find more host tissue. So it can move, and it uses chemotaxis, or, you know, detecting host chemicals, essentially, that are exuded. So, you know, it can find roots, essentially, of hosts. And then when it comes in contact with the root, it will, you know, allow the fungus to start colonizing it and, basically infect another host. Now, this disease generally affects stressed trees, wounded trees, things like that. And indeed, you know, we find this affecting mostly oaks and other hardwoods in our area that have been stressed somehow, stressed by drought or flood or something like that. And those are the ones that tend to be having the most issues with this. But once it colonizes a site, you're going to have a lot of this, and it tends to stick around for quite a while, decades. And in some parts of the world, and more temperate areas in North America, there are huge colonies of Armillaria. And it can be hundreds of acres in size, and they're thought to be also very, very old, you know, because they just keep persisting and colonizing stumps and living, you know, for very, very long periods of time. So we have signs and symptoms of this. You know, a lot of the symptoms you'd see, though, above ground would just be general things like the trees are weak, dying, you know, tops are dying back and things like that. And that could be caused by a lot of different things. It wouldn't necessarily be Armillaria. You wouldn't know that necessarily just from seeing those symptoms. You'd have to look, you know, below ground. You'd have to look a lot of other things. Unless you know, were able to tie it to, you know, seeing the fruiting bodies at the right time of the year and other stuff. So that's one of the issues with these root diseases, is that you can see above ground symptoms, and they can be very general. They can be something that could be caused by, you know, many potential causes, and then you have to do more investigative work to figure it out. Okay, so that's just a synopsis of, you know, a handful of signs and symptoms. We're going to see many more as we go through the semester. You know, even hopefully next week in person we'll be seeing some, and this is just to get, you know, kind of get your feet wet with it and get used to kind of the types of stuff to look for and how to start recognizing the differences between the different categories that we've talked about. All right, take care. Hope to see you soon.